Okay, good afternoon. Um, it's obviously a very serious topic, but let's try and have some fun with fraud today. I'm going to try and keep it lighthearted. So I'm going to tell my story, obviously the professional side of things, the fraud at work, kind of what he talks about, but I'm also going to talk about the personal side of things. I think like he mentioned about speaking up, that was not the environment where I worked, and my behavior and my actions on a personal level should have caused people to be speaking up early on, and that didn't happen until obviously deep into my fraud because it was a 4.5 year period that it happened. So I'm just going to start from basically from childhood and build the psychology behind how a somewhat maybe normal person goes down the path I went down. So I grew up in a small town in south central Minnesota. Looking back, I would say I had a very normal, if not better than normal, childhood. I think I had a very supportive family. I had a lot of success growing up, whether it was academically, athletically, socially. I had a great childhood, and it's sad to me that my focus at that time from a young age was money and the fact that we didn't have any. And so instead of focusing on all the positives in my life, I focused on money. And so I grew up with this skewed view of success and happiness where I thought you had to have money to be happy. And that really followed me through, from grade school on to high school and into college and in my career. So going through high school, I identified accounting early on as the path I wanted to take, and for a couple reasons. I took a class, I was good at it, I liked it, and what I thought was accounting was a respectable profession. I thought it would be financially lucrative, and I thought people would respect me in that profession. So I went to a small private college in south central Minnesota, really small private school, but it had a great accounting program. When I went to college for me was almost another shortcut. I didn't go to college, I didn't really go to get an education, and I didn't go to experience college the way I think kids should. I went there to get a degree, to get a job. I didn't really care about my grades. I just wanted to get through school and move on and get a job. So I finished college in 3.5 years. Moved up to the Twin Cities. Because of my not so great grades, I couldn't even get an interview with one of the big firms. So I went to work for a really small CPA firm in the Twin Cities. Literally a CPA, his wife, and his daughter. So really small group, very blue collar clientele, mechanics, liquor stores, plumbers, electricians, small businesses like that. So not big dollar type work, but it was a great way to get a good understanding of accounting. I got to work with small businesses and really learn the ins and outs of building an income statement and a balance sheet, taxes, things like that. So it was a great learning experience. What it was lacking in was money, first of all, which was my main goal. And after a short time, it just wasn't very challenging as a job. So I went looking for something else. I stuck out 2 years there because I knew I wanted to be a CPA and I needed that public experience. In October of 1997, I got a job with ReliStar Life Insurance Company in Minneapolis. I was hired in the reinsurance division. I didn't know anything about insurance, let alone reinsurance at the time. It's nice to speak to a group of people who know the industry. But that division was about 100 people, and it was weird to me because it was 100 people, but it was very high dollar and very volatile business. So I think at the height, we were probably doing $1 billion in gross premium for our little division, which was a lot of money. I started there in an entry-level position, just doing account recs, bank recs, journal entries, that type of thing. A very important piece to my story is the girl who trained me in on day one. She was the same age I was, and she happened to be engaged to a guy I knew from college, a guy that I played football with in college, and he had actually dated my wife's roommate in college. So we had a very quick connection, fast kind of friendship. Both her and I at work, and then as couples, and over the 10 years I worked with ReliStar and ING, her and I became extremely close friends, and she factors in heavily later in my story. One of the issues, like I said, it was a small group, and we had a small accounting group, so we probably had 6 accounting people, and we had a lot of issues. We had terrible controls, nothing like I've heard around here. We had bad controls, and it was an environment of get things done. Here's the right way to do things, but here's how we do things. Here's the shortcuts we use. Here's the workarounds we use. So things like password sharing, which I was talking to someone about, in my role, especially when I got a little further with more responsibility, there were things I could do in our system that no one else could do. And they were daily duties I had to do, approvals of certain things that I was the only person with that authority. So if I was out, literally I had to have somebody log in as me and do my work. And the girl that I mentioned that trained me in that first day, she worked from home a couple days a week, and working remotely in the early 2000s was not the way it is now. It wasn't always so smooth. She couldn't always get things done, so she might call me and say, hey, go log in as me and do this for me. So we shared passwords, and just like I said, in general, it was a very weak control environment. There was a lot of lacking segregation of duties. Things were just, it was the environment of get it done, and just little things like, I know that if I'm going to do a journal entry, I should write it up, have it approved, and then make the entry. It got to the point where I would do my journal entries. When auditors came around looking at it, that's when my boss would sign off on my entries. You know, it's not the right way to do things, but we were too busy getting things done to worry about doing things the right way. So that was the environment there. So some things that happened, ING came into the United States back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and started buying up life insurance companies. So they bought ReliaStar. At the time, I had just passed the CPA exam. I was promoted to accounting manager, so I was finally in a managerial role. So ING comes in and they say, all right, we bought all these life insurance companies. We need all of you to go on to PeopleSoft. So they built a team of accounting people from every division around the United States. And I was a part of this team, and basically our job was to provide input to the people setting up PeopleSoft so that we could get the functionality we needed, reporting functionality mostly, but every way we were going to use PeopleSoft, we got to give our input in how we were going to use it and what we needed. The other thing was they wanted us to become experts in PeopleSoft so we could train our staff, and so obviously when PeopleSoft went live, they knew there was going to be issues, and they thought if there's some people in every spot that have a better understanding of PeopleSoft, it might not be so ugly once we went live. So I did those two things. I became an expert in PeopleSoft, and again, it was one of those things where a bunch of parts of my job, I did things to, I helped set up PeopleSoft, and I didn't do that so that I could manipulate PeopleSoft later on and defraud auditors and everything, but it made it easier later on when I started committing fraud, the fact that I was so well-versed in PeopleSoft. Another thing that happened was Sarbanes-Oxley. So when we had a consulting firm come in and setting up our SOX controls, I was on the team that set up the controls. I was in charge of everything to do with cash. That was my main job, was all the money coming in and going out of our division. So my name was attached to every control around cash. So if an auditor came in our division and looked at our matrix, they were going to see my name. And again, I wasn't setting up controls to manipulate them later, but it made it a lot easier when I started stealing money to manipulate controls because I had set them up in the first place and I really understood how they worked. And the other thing was that I knew any auditor coming in was going to come straight to me. They weren't going to go to my boss. They weren't going to go to my coworkers. They were going to come to me. And so I was going to be the first line of defense of anyone asking a question about money. And all things that really helped me do what I did. So on a personal level, like I said, money had been my focus growing up, and I've tried to create the perfect kind of American dream. I wanted people to think that I was happy and successful, and I didn't really care if I was happy and successful. I just wanted people to think that I was. So I was kind of building a fake life. So I met my now ex-wife in prison, or not in prison, that's later, in college. And when I met her, I was lacking in confidence, to put it mildly. So when I met this amazing girl that I thought was, she is amazing, completely out of my league, beautiful, smart, funny. At the time, I thought this girl would never be into me, so I'm going to act like who I think she would want to be with. So I basically never let her get to know me. We dated, we got married, and we were together for years, and I never let her get to know the real me. I acted like the person I thought she would want to be with. So I had set up basically my personal life as a fraud. I had the perfect little, the white picket fence and the perfect wife, and then my wife got pregnant, and I was trying to create this perfect little life, and in reality, I was miserable on a personal level. I was miserable because every part of my life was a fraud, and my career was about to become a fraud too. So a couple years before I started stealing money, one of the biggest factors of my ability to do what I did happened. And it was probably around 2001. My boss comes into my office on a Friday afternoon and he says, I need you to wire $50 million to our London subsidiary. And it was 2 o'clock and he said it needs to go out today. And I would say on a daily basis, I probably sent out $20 million a day, but I had never sent out that large of a wire and I didn't even know how to find somebody that could approve it. So I was very hectically trying to find somebody that could approve this wire. So accounts payable, all of our corporate functions were in Atlanta for ING. Accounts payable put out it was called the authorization matrix, and it was literally just a spreadsheet of every person in ING Americas with any signing authority, whether it was checks or wires. It would have their name, business unit, checks or wires, and then their signing authority. So I was looking through this list trying to find somebody with unlimited authority or an amount over 50 million to find somebody to approve this wire. And as I was going through the list, I saw my own name. I saw my name along with the coworker that I mentioned. We both had signing authority on checks up to $250,000. I recognized, obviously, instantly, I shouldn't have signing authority. I'm an accountant. I'm the one who requests the money. I should never have approval authority. At the time, I thought a couple things. One thing very incorrectly, I'd never use it, so I don't need to worry about it. So instead of contacting accounts payable and saying, hey, revoke this authority, I just kind of threw it aside and said, I'd never use it. I don't need to worry about it. I'm more interested in getting this money sent out today. And so I just went on about my business. I found somebody to approve the wire, and I got the money out the door, and I went home. But it really hit me shortly thereafter that, hey, you know how to request a check, you know how to approve a check, you have signing authority, you have requesting authority, you know how to log in as your coworker who has the same authority, you could steal money. And it hit me kind of like, you could steal money. Again, at the time, I thought, I'd never do that. I'd never abuse that, flaw in the system or my coworker's trust who, gives me your password. So again, I just pushed it aside, but I literally went to work every day feeling like I had a pot of gold under my desk. When I was so focused on money, it was really a daily basis. I thought about, man, I could steal money and it would be really easy. And I always said, but I'd never do that. So a couple years go by, I'm going to work every day and I'm thinking about that stealing money and that little pot of gold and always thinking, nope, I'm not gonna do that. And then my wife got pregnant. And the way that I approached choices in my life was not what's right or wrong. I really never thought about my ethics or my morals when I was making decisions. I always just assumed I would make the right decision. But the other thing I would do is, I would think about things and say, well, what would the successful guy that I want to be, that I'm trying to fake who I am, what would that guy do in any situation? So when we were going to have a baby, I was thinking, well, the successful man would support the family. Your wife should stay home with the baby and you should be supporting the family, So I started kind of obsessing about that. So this was the summer of 2003. I started thinking about, financially speaking, could my wife, who had a great job, if she gives up her job, can I support the family? And now, when I started with ReliStar, I continued working nights and weekends at the CPA firm I worked at. So I literally worked 2 full-time jobs for 10 years, including the years where I was stealing millions of dollars. I was still working 2 full-time jobs. So working my normal job at ReliStar and ING, and then nights and weekends at the CPA firm. So I was thinking, okay, I still have 2 salaries. I can support the family even if we lose a third of our income if she stops working. The issue was when I met my wife, I was very ashamed of my financial situation. Coming out of college, I had a ton of school debt. I had a lot of credit card debt, and obviously money had always been an issue for me, so I was ashamed of all this debt I had, and I never told my wife about it. So when I was thinking about financially supporting the family, I thought I could do that, except for I have all this debt over here my wife doesn't even know about. So how am I going to pay off this debt over here when I have to support the family and try and take care of this stuff that she doesn't even know about? So that's when it really popped into my head that, you know what, you could steal money, you could pay off that debt, and then everything would be okay. So that's when I really started rationalizing stealing money. So I thought about it, and I very deliberately went into work one day and I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to steal money. I'm going to pay off this debt, and then everything will be okay. So once I decided I'm going to do it, I thought, how am I going to do it? I had to figure out, I knew physically how to get my hands, I knew how to cut a check, I knew how to get my hands on the check, but how am I going to pay off my debt? So I figured, we do business with, I have a credit card with a financial institution that we do business with. If I cut them a check on our system, the check's not going to look weird, other than being a small amount. It's just going to look like another payment to somebody we pay all the time. So I thought, okay, but what's my credit card company going to think if they start getting payments directly from my employer? I don't know if this is okay. So I called up my credit card company and I said, is it okay if my employer reimburses my travel expenses by sending checks to you directly? And the credit card company said, we don't care who pays us as long as somebody pays us. And I thought, thank you, perfect. So from there, I thought, okay, that's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to cut checks directly to my credit card, and so I went down that path. Now, the controls around getting my hands on the checks, I was going to do something completely outside of the norm. On a normal basis, the only way that payments were requested was our admin system sent a nightly batch over to PeopleSoft, requested the checks, our checks printed in another division in our Minneapolis campus. So basically, our admin system printed out a check register every morning. A girl who worked for me would take that check register, walk across the street to where the checks were printed. The checks were printed and stored in a 3-ring binder in a cubicle with no person in it. So it was basically an empty cubicle with a 3-ring binder with stacks of checks. So you would go over there would be a Post-it note to a paperclip stack of checks that said reinsurance. You would grab the checks, initial that you took them. So she would grab the checks, bring them back to my boss, the controller. He would sign off that the checks that printed tied to the check register from our admin system, and then from there they were dispersed. I happened to be the backup for both of those jobs. So if the girl who worked for me was out, I walked over and picked up the checks. If my boss was out, she would go pick up the checks and bring them to me. So I thought, I just need one of those two people to be out, and I can get my hands on my fraudulent check, basically. So the first time I did it, I waited until the girl who worked for me was going to be gone, so I would be able to go and pick up the checks. Later on in my fraud, if I needed money, I would call the girl that worked for me into my office, and I would say, hey, you've been doing a great job. Why don't you take the day off tomorrow? And she thought, you're the best boss ever, and I was slowly manipulating her to get my hands on fraudulent checks. So anyways, that first day, I go in, I request my check. So the process was I would go in log in as myself, request the check, log out, log right back in as my coworker, approve the check. Next morning, pick up the check register, go pick up the checks on my way back, take out my fraudulent check, put it in my pocket, hand the checks to my boss, and he's none the wiser. From there, I mailed the check straight to my credit card company. I could follow the process, both on my credit card statement online, and see that, okay, the check hit my credit card on day 2. Day 3, I can see on our accounts payable system, it cleared the bank, piece of cake. So starting from the second that I logged in as my coworker and approved that first fraudulent check, that was when the real misery started for me. Because whether that was the illegal thing I did, or if it was just unethical, whatever it was, that was the point at which I knew I had crossed the line, and that's when the anxiety and the depression and the guilt and the fear and every negative thing really hit me. And it got worse literally every day going forward for the next 4.5 years. Another weird thing, I think, is that I didn't think I'd get away with it. I thought I would get caught right away, which doesn't make a lot of sense why I would do it and continue to do it, but I didn't think there was any way I was going to get away with this. So it was almost shocking to me and scary that it was so easy. When the first one went so smoothly, it really scared me that I thought, this could really get out of control because it was way too easy. So after that first check, basically on a weekly basis, roughly over that summer, I would do the same thing. I would cut a check to my credit card company. I would mail it off. So I paid off that credit card first. Then I transferred balances to that credit card. So I paid off all my credit cards. Then I used convenience checks from that credit card to pay off my school loans. I paid off my car. I paid off a home equity loan my wife didn't know about. So I paid off all the debt that my wife didn't know I had. And so over that summer, I think I stole $88,000. Again, I went to work every day assuming that the FBI was going to jump out from under my desk and arrest me. I did not think I was going to get away with it. So it was a really weird feeling that it just kept working. It kept going so smoothly. So at the end of the summer, right before my daughter was born, I mailed off a check just like I had been doing. And day 2, it doesn't hit my credit card company. And day 3, it doesn't clear the bank. And I think, okay, somebody found it. I'm really going to be arrested now. And so a week goes by, and I don't hear anything. I don't see anything, and I'm really freaking out. I was literally walking around the Skyway system in Minneapolis just waiting to be arrested. And I was extremely stressed out. I didn't know if I was going to jail or just going to lose my job or what was going to happen, but I assumed that somebody had found it. A couple weeks go by. I go into work one day. I check my mail. I have an interoffice envelope from accounts payable. I open it up, and there's the check. What had happened is I forgot to put my account information on it, so when my credit card company received it, they didn't know how to apply it, so they just mailed it back to the address on the check, which was accounts payable in Atlanta. Accounts payable looked it up online, saw it was mine, and just sent it right back to me. Maybe not the best process. From there, my thought was, okay, you got away with one. This is your sign from God to stop this. Objectively, I had accomplished what I set out to do. I had paid off all my debt. My daughter was about to be born. I thought, this is your sign. And as far as the accounting to cover up that fraud, at that point, I could write off $200,000 a day. So to write off $88,000 over 3 months was nothing. So there's no big accounting cover up behind that. I just wrote off that money. So I went through my daughter was born in September of '03. I went through the year-end audit. Nothing was found, nothing was looked at. Obviously, I never wrote a check then over $5,500, so there was no materiality whatsoever with the fraudulent checks that I stole. So I made it through the year-end audit, and I think, okay, I'm home safe. Nobody's ever going to look back at that stuff. Let's just move forward. I'm debt-free. My daughter's life is good. This is where things get ridiculous. So in March of '04, I'm sitting at my desk, and literally the thought that goes through my head is, I went through all this work to steal money, and I didn't even do anything fun with it. Yeah, great idea, right? So I start thinking, how can I pick this up again? I mean, a whole 6 months after the scare, I'm ready to start stealing again, with a 6-month-old daughter. So I start basically brainstorming about how to do my fraud in a different way. I didn't like the credit card scheme I had because I felt like it gave control to somebody else. Sending those checks to somebody else took control out of my hands, and I wanted more control over the process. So I decided that I could just set up a company with the same name as somebody we do business with, and then I can cut checks. They're going to look like a normal check, but they're going to go straight into my company. And what kicked this off was, I'm not going to tell you who, but we did business with an insurance broker in Bermuda, and they did some really weird things. So you know how when money, you guys actually know, I always have to explain suspense to people, but so money comes in, goes into suspense, and with these payments, for some reason, we always had trouble applying them. They would not give us the contract information, so a lot of times we would receive a wire and then have to contact this broker and say, what's the money for? We don't know how to apply it. And sometimes if I was feeling lazy, I might just refund the money right to them and say, you deal with it if you're not going to tell us how to apply it. One time, we got a wire for $243,000. I call up the broker and I say, hey, we got this wire and we don't know how to apply it. And the guy on the phone said, I don't know what it's for and don't send it back. And okay. But I thought at the time, that's when it really hit me. I could refund that money right to myself. I can set up a company with the same name as this broker, and I can send that money right back to myself. So that's what I did. I set up a company on paper. I filed the name with the Secretary of State. I got a federal ID number. I got a business bank account and a P.O. box. I had a business that looked like a business on paper, but it was solely set up to steal money. So I went through that process. Again, this was March of 2004. It took a couple weeks to get everything in place. And I, again, went into work and I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to steal money again. So my first fraudulent check in what I call phase 2 of my fraud was $27,000 and change. I requested it, picked it up on a Friday. I had it with me at work on Saturday. It was tax season, so I was working a nice 15-hour day on Saturday. So at lunch, I went to my local Wells Fargo, who's I'm now banned for life from Wells Fargo, but they have their own issues. Went to Wells Fargo, and again, as I was approaching the bank teller with this check, I was thinking, this is not gonna work. You know, like a SWAT team's gonna jump out from behind the bank teller and arrest me. It's just, there's no way this is gonna work. So I walk up, I present the check, and the bank teller does her thing and hands me the receipt, and the money is available instantly. And again, I just thought this was way too easy. I went back to work, and I had $27,000 in my new fraudulent bank account, and I had, at the time, it was almost like I didn't have anything that I wanted to buy. I didn't have anything specifically that I thought I needed. I just thought, oh, if you have money, you'll probably figure out how to spend it. So from there, my fraud increased over the next 4 years. So like I said, my first fraudulent check was $1,100. And then, you know, phase 2 started with $27,000, and it was 53 and 70, and it increased. It got to the point in 2006, there was a day I stole $400,000 in one day. So in the end, I stole $8,455,778.55, which even shocked me once I figured out how much I had stole. The weird thing, well, a lot of weird things. One of the weird things, I am an accountant, so I kept very detailed spreadsheets of my fraud. I tracked everything I stole, how I spent it. The FBI was very appreciative of my efforts. But the thing was, I never wanted to know how much I stole. So I tracked it, but I kept the balance column off the screen. I never wanted to know how much I stole, but I tracked it diligently. So how I got caught was not how I thought I would get caught. Number one, I figured with the amount of audits that go on, there's no way somebody's not gonna find it. We had our internal auditors who were digging through my stuff 2 or 3 times a year. We had our external auditors in a couple times a year. We had our SOX consultants testing our controls constantly throughout my fraud. We had state insurance exams, which could be pretty nasty. There was people digging where I held the fraud constantly. And I thought somebody's gonna find it, and nobody ever did. The next place I thought might be the IRS. Now, as a very ethical CPA, I knew that even if you steal money, you have to put it on your taxes, so I reported it all on my taxes, which shocked the US attorney and the FBI. But yeah, I ran it through a Schedule C on my taxes. It looked like I had a very lucrative consulting business on the side, but I thought the income growth on my tax return over that 4-year period might raise some red flags. It did not. Just a side note so I reported all the stolen money on my taxes. For my 2006 and 2007 tax year, I got busted before they were filed and paid. So I owed about $2.6 million from 2006 and 2007, which followed me through to, as of last week, it was $4.1 million I owed the IRS. This week, after a 6-year struggle, the IRS finally accepted my offer in compromise, and I paid $426 to settle my $4.1 million tax debt this week. So that's very exciting for me, probably not for you, but. So anyways, I thought the IRS might come dig, and they didn't come knocking till after I got in trouble. Obviously, the last place I thought might be someone internally, and especially my coworker who number one, I was extremely close with, and number two, she had as good of understanding of any process, you know, any of the processes that I did. Even though she worked more on the reporting side of things, and I worked more on the cash side, she understood everything. She was amazing in PeopleSoft, in our admin system. I thought if anyone was going to find it, it would be her, especially the fact that I was using her ID to steal the money. So what happened was, in August of 2007, we got an email from accounts payable, and the email was to my boss, to my coworker and I, and it said, if you two want to keep your signing authority of $250,000 on checks, you have to have this paperwork signed 5 years after the fact. And what I thought was, this isn't good. You know, again, on a personal level, my life had so crumbled by this point. I was literally in a holding pattern of almost suicidal, but just waiting for it to be all over. I'd stopped stealing money. My life was completely in shambles, but I was still scared about what was going to happen when I got caught, even though I wanted it to be over. So I was in a weird spot where I wanted it to be over without going to prison and everything that I knew was coming. So life at this point was truly miserable. So when this email comes, I say, okay, this is not good. Now that my boss and my coworker know that I had this signing authority that I've been abusing for the last 4.5 years, it's going to cause her to start looking around. And so as soon as that email hit, my boss stands up and walks out of his office, and I hear my coworker walk out. And so I walk out there, and our boss says, "Did you guys know you had signing authority?" And I said, "No, do you need that?" "No." And so he went back, revoked our authority at that point. Same week, my coworker had lunch with my wife. Now, on a personal level, my wife and I had split up in June of '06, so almost 15 months before we had split up. I was in a place where I was pushing everyone in my life away, and I had separated from my wife, but I couldn't figure out how to go through a divorce without divulging my financial information to a judge. So I was kind of putting off the divorce and just stringing her along. And her and my coworker remained friends, so they had lunch one day the same week that she found out about this authority, and the topic of conversation at that lunch was me, because I had changed so much as a person throughout that time. I was in no way the same person I'd been, before my fraud started. I'd put on a bunch of weight. I was completely withdrawn in every way from any relationship I'd ever had. I was miserable. I was depressed. I didn't talk. I was not the same person at all. And then obviously there was the money side of things, which I'll explain. Obviously, if you steal and spend $8.5 million, people notice. So they were talking about the changes in me and the money, and as a result, my coworker came back, did a little digging, found some things, passed them along to our boss. So again, on a Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock, my boss comes into my office and hands me a query, and he says, "Can you give me the backup for these checks?" And I look at the query, and it's $1 million in checks I had stole that year. And I think, I started sweating. And at the time, I assumed that he knew what I had done, and I thought he was kind of just messing with me. So it turned out that day, the girl who worked for me that would have had the backup for those checks, had it actually existed, she happened to be out that day. So I talked my way out of the office that Friday and just said we're going to have to wait till Monday when she's back to find the backup. So I went home that night, and I literally thought I had two options. I could either kill myself and just get it all over with, because life was so miserable at this point, or I had to get a lawyer and face things head on. And luckily, I had my daughter that night, so I thought, okay, I can't kill myself. I started researching lawyers. I got a lawyer on the phone that night. We set up an appointment for Saturday at noon, so I went into the office on Saturday morning and started very desperately to try and cover up my fraud. I started shredding documents. I started creating fake documentation for all my payments. I created perfect fake documentation for my payments. It looked legitimate. So from there, I went to my lawyer's office, and the first thing my lawyer said was, "Don't shred anything, don't." I was like, So anyways, he convinced me at that meeting, "Listen, you need to go into work Monday and see what they know. We need to know what they know." And I said, I've been going to work every day for the last 4 years assuming I was going to be arrested, and if I go into work Monday, I'm going to be arrested. And he said, "You need to go in there and see what they know." So I went in Monday morning, went right into my boss's office with my fake documentation. I explained to him this is refunds of money from this broker that we couldn't figure out how to apply, so I would just send it back to him. And he said, "Oh, okay." And I thought, man, did I get away with this? And he said, "Oh, I just need to go show it to Mike." And Mike was our CFO. And Mike was also the guy whose signature I faked on all my fake documentation. So I thought, as soon as he shows this stuff to Mike, obviously Mike's going to say, "I didn't sign any of this stuff." So my boss headed towards the stairs to go show this stuff to our CFO. I went to my office, packed up my stuff quick, and ran to my car and squealed out of the parking lot. So I found out later they didn't suspect me in any way till I squealed out of the parking lot. So, note to all you fraudsters. So anyways, I went home at that point, and again, like I said, my life was so completely in shambles at this point. So like I said, I was separated from my wife. By this time, I was no longer speaking with my parents, my sister. Most of my friends weren't talking to me anymore. I had a girlfriend that neither my family nor my wife knew about, who was 5 months pregnant. So I had to go home to my pregnant girlfriend and say, "Sorry, everything you know about me is a lie. The money's all stolen. I'm going to prison." And then I had to sit there and wait. I assumed some sort of law enforcement would show up and arrest me. And so nothing happened on that Monday. Tuesday, nothing happened. At about 10:30 Tuesday night, there's a knock on my door, and I think, okay, here it is. I open the door, and it's two internal fraud investigators from ING, and they, as soon as I open the door, start screaming at me. It was like bad cop, bad cop. They're screaming at me about the checks and this and that, and I said, listen, I'm going to cooperate. I'm ready to talk, but I'm not going to do it, at 10:30 on my doorstep without my lawyer present. And they were not having any of that. They just continued to scream at me. And I just said, hey, I'm ready to cooperate, but you have to wait till my lawyer's involved. And so they literally sat at the end of my driveway all night, and then starting the next morning, continued to call me and harass me until my lawyer finally got out of court. They called me and left a message and said, if you don't open the door right now, we're going to call the police and tell them we think you're committing suicide and have them come and kick your door in. And I said, I told you as soon as my lawyer's out of court, he will contact you. So my lawyer got out of court, contacted ING's legal department, and then from there, it was complete cooperation on my part. I'll talk about that whole process later. So let's talk about the cover-up. Obviously, there's the cover-up at work, the accounting behind how do you hide $8 million, but then there's the cover-up at home, because like I said, you can't steal $8 million and not have people notice. So for me, it was probably more work covering it up at home. So early on in my fraud, it wasn't that hard to lie about stealing a little bit more money and spending a little more money than I was used to. Everybody knew that I worked 2 jobs. Nobody knew how much money I really made. My wife was the type of person who was completely unmaterialistic, didn't care about money at all, didn't care about our finances. She let me completely handle our finances and do our taxes and everything. And the thing was, we kept separate finances. She had her own bank accounts and credit cards. I had my own, and then we literally had one joint bank account that we funded both to pay our bills. So she didn't know how much money I made. She didn't pay attention to any of that stuff. So when I started buying more things here and there, she didn't really notice. Another thing I used to lie to people was the CPA I worked for, everybody knew he wanted me to take over for him when he retired. So I just was telling people, he's trying to entice me to take over, so he's giving me more money and more clients, and just a little bit of extra money there explained some of the purchases I was making. But I got to the point where I want to buy something expensive, and how am I going to do that and explain a purchase? I wanted this motorcycle that was $35,000. How am I going to explain that? So again, I started brainstorming, how am I going to explain this? I'd never been a gambler, but I knew from doing taxes that if you win a jackpot over $1,200, they give you a little tax form that says you won X amount of dollars. So I thought, if I could go to a casino and win X amount of jackpots, I could explain a purchase. So I thought, okay, I grabbed $50,000 and went to the casino and won $35,000 and came home and said, hey, I just happened to be at a casino and won $35,000. And people were like, oh, that's so exciting. You're so lucky. And I thought, okay, this works. I called it almost like socially laundering the money, because I wasn't laundering my money because I was running it through a bank account, but I was laundering it in the fact that I had to come up with a reason to have this money to spend. So I thought, I'm going to keep doing this whole gambling thing. It turned into a very vicious OCD cycle of literally over the 4-year period, on a daily basis, 7 days a week, I went to an ATM and I took out my daily limit on every bank account and every credit card I had. So every single day for 4 years, I was withdrawing between $5,000 and $8,000 a day in $20 bills. I had wrapped them up in a little $2,000 bundles and threw them in my work bag, and then I would sneak off to casinos to try and play. And so at any one time, if you looked in my work bag under my desk at work, there was $10,000 to $30,000 in there. And then I would sneak off and play and just try and accumulate these jackpots. And again, I didn't care if I won or lost, because I could always steal more money. I just needed those W-2Gs to explain my purchases. Now, like probably everyone knows, nobody wins at casinos. So, after the 3rd time of, hey, I'm so lucky, people are like, what's going on? We don't buy that you're winning any money. And I was like, no, I'm that lucky guy, So a couple things happened that really helped me further this part of the fraud. My wife hated gambling. She didn't like me gambling. She didn't like Vegas. She didn't like any of that stuff. But a couple of her friends from high school asked us to join them in Vegas for a weekend. This was towards the end of 2004. I had been doing the gambling thing for about 6 months at this point. So we go to Vegas to meet her friends, and I think this is perfect. I'm going to try and win money and have my wife see it. Have somebody like witness the win type of thing. So we got back from dinner one night with her friends, and I literally snuck into the high stakes video poker room and started playing, and just on a fluke, I hit a $30,000 jackpot. So I made a big deal about it. Her and her friends were standing right outside, and I was like, hey, look at this, I won all this money. And from there, I was teaching her how to play blackjack, and I ended up going on a crazy run. So that weekend, I won $56,000. Crazy. So I'm taking pictures with the money, and I'm sending it to friends and showing people at work, and look how lucky I am. And I really use that to say, hey, people that don't buy my story, talk to the most trustworthy girl in the world. She saw it happen. And so I really used that. And then 6 months later, I convinced her to go back to Vegas with me. And by this time, I was going to Vegas pretty regularly. So again, I snuck down a bunch of money my wife didn't know I had with me. Saturday afternoon, we came in from hanging out at the pool, and she said, I'm going to take a nap. Do you want to take a nap? And I said, no, I'm just going to play a little bit. And she gave me the disapproving look, and I was like, no, I'll be good. And so I went and I started playing, and I was playing $125 hand video poker. And I'd been playing for a half hour, and I hit a little jackpot, like a $6,000 jackpot, and I thought, okay. And just as I had given the attendant my information, my wife walks in and sits down. And I say, well, it's going to take them a couple minutes to bring back the money, so I'm just going to keep playing. So I moved over one seat, I put two $100 bills in the machine, and I hit a $100,000 jackpot. So I'm thinking, what's with the good luck charm here? When I talked about my record keeping, I also kept daily win-loss on my gambling. So I had a nice spreadsheet of all my gambling winnings and more losings. But I know that out of my 40 trips to Vegas, I lost money on every trip except 3 times. 3 times in Vegas I won money, and 2 of them were with my wife. So it was just a fluke that she was there to see. That weekend I hit a $100,000 jackpot, went on a little run playing blackjack. I won $122,000 that weekend. So again, I went home. I had them cut me a check for that $100,000. I waved it in everybody's face at work. I didn't tell them, hey, I was betting big hands. I just said, oh, I got so lucky. And people were like, this is amazing. Another Wells Fargo shot. So I take the $100,000 to my local Wells Fargo to put it in my bank account, deposit it. I go back to my desk. I check online. They credited my account for $1 million. So I call them up and I say, hey, I just deposited $100,000 in my bank account, but you credited my account for $1 million. And the girl said, they'll figure it out. Anything else? And I said, no, that's it. And she said, all right. And so it took them 9 days to take the $900,000 back out. So interesting. Anyways, but that really helped me further that part of the fraud. Like having this extremely honest, trustworthy person see me win 2 times in Vegas. It really helped convince people that I really was winning, even though I was losing like crazy, and I just didn't care. Because like I said, it just became a cycle of getting money, sneaking to casinos, playing, going to Vegas, and I mean, I got to the point I was wiring $200,000 a weekend down to Vegas to go and play, and I mean, I just got completely out of control. And to put the money in context, the gambling, my W2G winnings over those years, which these were the winnings I was using to explain my purchasing, So in 2004, my W2G winnings were 178,000. In 2005, it was 380,000. 2006 was 870,000, and 2007 was 1.3 million. So that was the money I was telling people I was making. The reality of the situation was, out of the $8.5 million I stole, I lost 6.2 million of it gambling. So it just became a flip from using the gambling to cover up my fraud to I just started stealing to gamble. It's all I cared about. So very ugly cycle. And like everything, people stopped believing the gambling thing too. And at that point, for a number of reasons, I just pushed everyone in my life away. I thought, splitting from my wife, if she's not living with me, if she's not there, she's not going to see what I'm up to. If I'm not talking to my parents anymore, they're not going to question what I'm doing and where the money's coming from, and my friends. And I pushed everyone, every healthy relationship I had, I pushed away, and I surrounded myself with people who would not question what I was doing. My girlfriend at the time only knew me as this person with a lot of money. She never questioned. She knew that I worked 2 jobs and that I was working constantly, but she never questioned where all the money was coming from. And I just surrounded myself with people who wouldn't question it, people who wanted to go along for the ride. So it was one of those things where I just think you don't want to assume the worst in your loved ones, and people probably had a lot of thoughts about what was wrong with me, but I think people just didn't want to believe it, and certainly didn't want to confront me about it. So it was one of those things, once the truth came out, everybody in my life was like, oh, that makes sense, Obviously, it all makes sense in hindsight, but, it was so emotionally draining to just lie and lie and lie and push people away. So that part of the fraud was more work than anything. The personal side of things, it was miserable and horrible, and my life in general was just complete misery throughout this whole process. So over to the work side, so the cover up, obviously, most people in here have accounting backgrounds. You guys know what a debit is? I'm kidding. So every time I steal money, I'm sticking a debit out there, okay? So I call it the fraudulent debit. So every time I steal a check, I'm sticking a debit out there that I gotta explain and try and get rid of. Obviously, I don't know if obviously, but I had no intention of paying the money back, so I had to figure out how to get rid of that debit. So the two pieces, on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, I had to explain why this debit is out here. So I decided to stick that debit in the messiest account I dealt with. So we had a Canadian subsidiary where everything was handled in Canada. So we had an office, they processed all the contract work, they handled all the money, they received all the money, paid all the money, they kept the assets up there, backing the reserves, everything was done in Canada, and then it just had to trickle onto onto PeopleSoft basically. So on a monthly basis, they had three pieces to their business. They had contract-related stuff, which they handled in our admin system that they had access to up there. They had general expenses, which they would send to me, and I would make an entry into PeopleSoft for. And then they had investment activity. All of our investments in Canada were in 10 million Canadian dollar increments. So it was T-bills and bonds. So on a monthly basis, they would send me their investment activity, which consisted of buying and selling T-bills and bonds, and then receiving interest payments. I had to translate them from Canadian dollars to US dollars, forward it down to Atlanta to investment accounting for them to make the entry. So those were the three pieces. The other thing I had to do was reconcile their bank account. And it was an extremely ugly reconciliation because it was one ledger account on PeopleSoft in US dollars, and that was 5 actual bank accounts in Canada, 3 in Canadian dollars and 2 in US dollars. So it was a reconciliation that was never gonna tie to zero because it was a foreign currency reconciling to a US dollar account, 5 accounts into one. It was just a really ugly, messy thing. And so this whole package in general that I had to do was a big, ugly monster of a job that I was the only person who ever did it for the 10 years I was there. So nobody really understood how it all worked and how it all linked together, whether it was my boss or auditors. So I thought this is the perfect place for me to stick my fraud. So as that debit's growing out there, for the example, let's say there's $3 million of fraudulent debit sitting in this account. It was literally the Canadian bank's ledger account on PeopleSoft. So that debit is sitting out there. So on off quarter and months, my boss verified my reconciliation, and he verified the balance on my reconciliation with a query I gave him. So I would query the balance in this account. I would download the query into Excel. I would go in and I would subtract $3 million off the balance and print it out. So rocket science. I would change the balance on my account rec and everything looked fine. I'd show it to my boss and he would sign off on it. So on quarter end months, it was different. I knew that my boss and auditors and whoever else were gonna tie out this reconciliation right to a trial balance. So I couldn't manipulate the balance. I had to manipulate my reconciliation. So I had to come up with basically a fake reconciling item to explain the $3 million debit sitting there. So I knew that when investment accounting did their entry for the investment activity at ING, they did one entry for all the investment activity in ING Americas. So it ended up being thousands of lines of entry for representing billions of dollars in activity. So I would query that entry every month. I would download it into Excel. I would find a roughly $3 million entry. I would go in and I would change the business unit and the account to my business unit and my account and make it look like when they made their entry, they screwed up and hit our bank account instead of somebody else's. So it looked like somebody debited our account for $3 million. And so I would put it on my bank rec and just say investment income, hit our account in error, should have gone to, Security Life of Denver or whatever company it should have gone to. It's a reversing entry, so by the time I'm explaining it to auditors or I'm explaining it to my boss, it's already corrected itself. And a $3 million entry wasn't that material to the amounts we were dealing with. So every quarter, people signed off on it. Now, if you're talking about internal auditors or external auditors that come in and they look at my stuff once or twice a year, it's not gonna look weird, but I had the exact same reconciling item on that rec 16 quarters in a row. So Across time, you might notice that investment income screwed up their entry 16 quarters in a row. But that's how I hid that fraud in there. So again, not rocket science, but just my ability to manipulate certain things. And one of the biggest risks I had the first time I did that was I thought, okay, if I'm going to say I have a reconciling item that should have gone to Security Life of Denver, are my auditors going to call the auditors in Denver and say, hey, do you have this offsetting reconciling item? And they never did that. They just noted the reconciling item and went on about their business. That no one ever talked to the people in the other places I was saying the offset of this item was. So, I mean, that was literally that. The other side of things, the tougher part was, how am I going to make this go away? I'm not paying this money back, but I got to figure out how to get rid of this debit. I can't stay out there forever, or I'm tied to this desk forever, you know? So I couldn't write it off. Our write-off rules had changed, and it was not the old west of write-offs the way it had been in the past for me. I couldn't just write off big amounts like that. I couldn't expense it because the one thing our cost managers were good at was watching over their expenses, because that's how their bonuses were calculated. So I couldn't slip $1,000 in somebody's cost center without them screaming at me. And in general, I didn't want to make an entry just for my fraud. I didn't want to make an entry that the only explanation for this entry is to get rid of my fraud. So I had to figure out a place that I could manipulate entries that were already happening that I can manipulate to try and eat away at this debit out here. So again, with this Canadian thing I did, on a monthly basis, they would send me their investment activity. Now, it could be a large amount of money in that they could buy and sell a couple bonds in a month, $10 million each. They could potentially have $40 or $50 million in activity just in buying and selling T-bills or bonds, and they're also going to receive, a large interest payments on a monthly basis. So the normal process was I would get that activity, I would load it into Exhibit, I would calculate the average monthly exchange rate from Canadian dollars to US dollars. I would translate those Canadian dollars to US dollars using that rate, and then I would forward it down to a entry-level person in investment accounting, and she would make the entry for it. I started looking at that, and I say, okay, if I know what the entry is supposed to be, well, if I manipulate the exchange rate I'm using, up or down, depending on whether it's money coming in or going out, I can eat away at that debit. So every time there's a debit going into that account, anytime we sell a bond or a T-bill, if I figure out the rate it's supposed to be and then I use a lower rate, I'm going to debit my account for less than it should be debited for. And if we're purchasing bonds or T-bills, if I figure out the rate and then I raise the rate by a little bit, I'm going to credit my account for more than it should be credited for. So basically, over that 4-year period, I did that on a monthly basis. Obviously, if you looked at this exhibit, every entry, whether it's money coming in or going out, should be translated using the same exchange rate, but all the credits used one rate and all the debits used another rate. And so literally I just did that to underreport investment income in our Canadian subsidiary, and over that 4-year period, I whittled away about $5.5 million of that $8.5 million. So I basically underreported investment income by $5.5 million over that 4-year period by just messing with that rate. So again, it was a risk that the girl who made the entry for me might notice that all the credits were one rate and all the debits were another rate, but I knew her and I knew that she was an entry-level person that wasn't going to question what I gave her. The other thing I had to do was I obviously had to verify this entry with my boss. So I would do the exhibit the correct way. My boss would sign off on the entry. I would go back. I would adjust the debits and the credits up or down. I would make the entry. The next month, I had to query that entry so he could verify that I made the entry approved. I would query the entry, download it into Excel, type in the entries that should have been made, print it off, and show it to my boss. So again, the fact that there was no really independent verification of any of the queries I ever showed auditors or my boss, I was able to just download anything I wanted into Excel and make it say whatever I wanted. My boss didn't know how to run a query. Auditors didn't have the ability to query my stuff. They all depended on the information I gave them. So regardless of what auditors wanted in general, if they wanted reports from PeopleSoft, I could go into PeopleSoft, take a report they wanted, manipulate it to make it say whatever I wanted. If it was something I should have done 6 months ago, I could run the query, make a copy of it with a date stamp from another thing. One of the nicest things auditors did for me was they gave me 2 weeks to provide them with everything they always asked for. They'd give me a list and say, hey, in 2 weeks, can you give us this? And it was always, give us copies of this. So I could I could basically fake anything any auditor ever asked me for because they gave me weeks to do it, they never watched me run reports, and they accepted copies of the actual items. So again, that's not rocket science, but it was really that basic, that it was just manipulating queries because I could download into Excel. It was providing copies of things because I could fake any report anyone ever asked for. So that was basically the cover-up. The other thing I would do was, just in general, number one, every auditor that ever came into my office was never older than 24. No offense to you youngins, but you don't necessarily know everything yet by 24, especially you have insurance and then you have reinsurance, which I think is a little more complicated in general. And so what I would do is, with the Canadian package, they would send me down all these different items. So they would send me spreadsheets and trial balances. They would send me, I don't know if anybody remembers that old green line dot matrix paper, those big reports. They would send me a bunch of that, and I would take my thing, and when I did my reconciliation, I would use 5 different colored highlighters, and I would highlight everything, and I would sit the auditors down, and I would say, okay, here's how this works. And I would just start like doing this and pointing all over the place, and the auditors would just be like, and in the end, they'd be kind of glazed over eyes, and they'd say okay and note things and then go on about their day. So I just tried to confuse and manipulate people. And the one thing I've heard, which I'd never thought of before, but one thing I've heard a lot as I've been speaking over the last couple of years, specifically to internal auditors and external auditors, audit directors have told me that their issue with their young auditors is that it's a mindset of when a young auditor sees something that doesn't look right, they want an explanation of why it's okay, not why it's not okay, or not what the actual truth is. They want to be able to say, that's a reasonable explanation, I can sign off on this and move on. So it's a mindset thing for me that I never really thought of, that if you're going into it and you want to believe what I'm going to say, then I'm going to give you a reasonable enough explanation of why it's okay. And that's what happened in every single audit I ever had. There was one auditor I had, one external auditor she was a manager, so she never really looked at my stuff, but she would sit in and things sometimes, and I thought, this girl scares me because she's super smart, and if she actually starts digging into my stuff, I'm in trouble. And she walked into my office one day and pulled up a chair right in front of me, and I thought, oh, this is it. She figured it out. She sat down and she said, I heard you like to go to Vegas. Do you play blackjack? And I thought, well, I'm fine with this one. She just wanted to talk about gambling in Vegas. So yeah, I mean, there were literally every auditor that ever came in, even though they accepted what I said, every auditor was digging in the right spot, and they were asking the right questions, but they stopped short every time. They always accepted that first answer and never pushed far. There were times when I was sitting there sweating, saying, if they ask one more question, I can't explain it. I'm going to be screwed if they ask the next question, and they never did. They always just, okay, noted it, moved on. It was, like I said, the environment where I worked was bad. Our internal audit staff was extremely weak, and to a T, they would have their audit program in front of them, and they were just literally checking boxes. That's all they cared about was, this is what we did last year, so this is what we're going to do now. I'm comfortable enough that I can initial this thing and move on to the next thing. I don't have time to worry about what you're actually doing up here. So I think that's pretty important. I think it's really important that and I don't know how, I've never audited, I don't know how you guys have the time to do all the work you have to do. I hear that complaint a lot, that it's a timing thing, that we don't have time. And again, when I look at a 24-year-old auditor coming in and trying to understand something that took me years to understand, I don't know how they could do that, how they could reasonably understand a process that took me years to truly understand, that even my boss doesn't understand. How's a kid fresh out of college going to do that? I don't know how they're going to do it, but I know that that's played a big part in why I was able to do what I did for so long. So that's the cover-up. I guess next I'll talk about what happened after I got caught. So the whole legal process. So I get caught. ING started investigating. They called my lawyer one day and they said, we think he stole $8,455,778. Do you agree with that? My lawyer calls me, and he had asked me initially, how much did you steal? I said, I don't know, $5 million, and I never looked. And so he calls me up and he says, ING thinks you stole this amount of money. Are they right? And I said, hold on, let me open my spreadsheet. So I had to open my spreadsheet and move over one column, and I said, yep, they're right. So it was actually nice that we agreed on the loss amount right away. There was no arguing about it. It's usually one of the bigger things in a white-collar case is the actual fraud amount, and we agreed from the start. So from there, I went in and I met with ING's fraud investigators. It was a meeting, me, my lawyer, the 2 fraud investigators from my doorstep, some of the internal legal staff, and then the law firm that was handling the civil side of this case. So we met at the law firm. We had, I don't know, a 6 or 8 hour meeting where I explained my fraud to them. I told them everything. And obviously it was an interview process. They had my laptop, which I was like, why didn't I grab that laptop? They had my laptop. So they were asking me a bunch of questions. And from that point, I was thinking, I'm coming clean. So they're asking me questions that had nothing to do with anything. For some reason, they didn't believe me when I told them they were asking the wrong questions. But we went through the process. I explained everything. I explained how I did everything. I explained the controls I manipulated, why it was so easy, things they could change to make it harder for it to happen in the future. I understand there are some employees of that place now that are not pleased with me because of the red tape they have to go through to get their job done now. So from this meeting, at this meeting, I also signed over all my assets that I had left right from the start. From there, they said, okay, for your cooperation, we'll let you know when we're going to turn it over to the authorities so it's not a surprise, and we'll be honest with them about your cooperation. So from there, it was a waiting game, and I didn't know what to expect. Like I said, I had a baby on the way. I was unemployed, and I didn't know what to expect. I was just sitting there waiting for something to happen. So a couple months went by, and in January of 2008, finally my lawyer was contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And in prison, most of the guys I was in prison with, including the white-collar guys, dealt with large groups of FBI agents with guns drawn arresting them. And in my case, they would just call my lawyer on the phone and say, hey, we want to meet with them. So kind of a weird thing. I was sentenced to 97 months in federal prison, and I've never been arrested. I've never been in handcuffs. No part of the process was really what I was expecting. So it was I don't know the word to describe. Obviously, it was scary, it was interesting, but the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office were so professional throughout the process. I think they made it as I don't know, not easy as can be, but it could have been a lot worse. And I think a big factor in what happened was when I went in to meet with them day one, I brought in spreadsheets basically explaining my entire fraud. I brought in my copies of tax returns, I brought in all my bank statements, all my credit card statements, and I handed that to them on day one and said, here's my crime. And they said, no one's ever done this before. But just that my cooperation and honesty from the start, it really helped me. It made the working relationship, if you want to call it, between us, it made it, I think, as professional as possible. And they never acted like they took personally what I did, the way that ING's people really seemed to take it personally what I did. It was if it wasn't my prosecution, it would have been a pretty interesting process. But the fact that I was the one being prosecuted, it made it a little different. So anyways, the process basically starting in January of 2008, I went in, I explained the crime to them. Once they understood what I did, how I did it, the real focus then is the money. How can we find what's left, what is left, that type of thing. So on a monthly basis, I would work with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to track down money. And so in July of 2008, I was indicted, and they served a forfeiture case on pretty much everybody in my life that I gave any of the fraudulent money to, or loaned money to, gave gifts to, any of that stuff. So I had a lot of not happy people in my life at that point as their bank accounts were being frozen and their assets were being taken. So I had my first court appearance in July of 2008. I had my plea hearing in October of 2008 where I pled guilty to 1 count of mail fraud. And then I had my sentencing in January of 2009. Now, sentencing in the federal system, the way it works is basically there's a point system, and you're given points for all these different pieces of your crime. And then when you have your point total, they go to a chart, and it's basically X, here's your points, here's the suggested range for your sentence. So the points in my case, the 1 count of mail fraud is 7 base points, and then the fraud amount is normally the biggest factor in your sentencing. The points for my fraud, I fell under the $7 to $20 million range, which is 20 points. So that's 27 points. I got 2 points for abusing a position of trust. So even though the position of trust I had was the check approval authority, even though it was an error, I still abused it. So that was 2 points. I got 2 points for defrauding a financial institution of more than $1 million. And I got 2 points for sophisticated means. So that's 33 points, and then you can get points back for cooperation, either 2 or 3 points, depending on your level of cooperation. I got back the full 3 points. So that's a 30. So you go to the chart, 30 points, the suggested range is 97 to 121 months, and I was sentenced to 97 months in federal prison. From there, again, the judge says, okay, I'm gonna give you 5 weeks to get your life in order. Show up at prison before noon on February 16th. So I was put in FBC Duluth, which is a minimum security prison about 2 hours north of the Twin Cities. So for me, it was the ideal location. It's where I wanted to be. My sister had to drive me to prison and drop me off, and it was a very scary process. Obviously, I didn't know what to expect going to prison. I was really scared. Personally, I was a mess. I had truly given up on life. You know, I had put on a bunch of weight. When I went to prison, I was almost 300 pounds. I assumed that, you know, my girlfriend would leave me when I was in prison. I assumed after prison I would never have anything. I would never have a real job. I would never have anything. And I was just a depressed, miserable person who had really given up on every part of life. So I go to prison day one, half expecting like the penitentiary and half expecting to play golf for a couple years at, you know, Club Fed. So I really didn't know what to think. So I showed up there. It turns out FBC Duluth is about 85% low-level drug crimes. So it was a lot of people that were not the type of people I was used to dealing with. It wasn't a bunch of white-collar guys. It was a bunch of everything but white-collar guys. So again, that was very, very scary for me. So I go in there on day one and I find out everybody in prison has to have a job. That prison is a 100-acre compound, and it's an old Air Force base, and literally the prison is run by inmates. So the plumbers, the electricians, the construction workers, the landscapers, the people who clean the dorms, the people who cook the food, every inmate has a job there. So my cellies knew I had an education, so they said, why don't you go up to the education department, maybe you can be a tutor or something. So I dragged myself up to the education department on day two, you know, just truly miserable, and I walked into the education department, and the first guy I ran into, the first inmate, he said, you know, what can I do for you? And I just said, hey, I just got here, I'm looking for a job, and he sat me down and you know, said, what's your story? And I told him my story, and you know, which included a lot of crying and a lot of you know, my life is over, and once I finished telling him my story, he just looked at me and he said, your life's not over. He said, this is your opportunity. This is your opportunity to work on yourself and to become who you want to be, you know? You can become the person you were faking for all those years. Who has the luxury of years and years to focus solely on themselves? Because in the real world, you don't have that luxury. You have responsibilities, and in prison, your responsibility is taking care of yourself. So at first I thought he was crazy, you know, to look at prison as an opportunity, but with some motivation on his part, I started to believe him, and you know, the first thing I did was I started exercising, and I lost 75 pounds the first 5 months I was in prison, and that really cleared my head and gave me a little confidence. And I got a job in education as a clerk, where I had a very rewarding job where I got to help guys get ready to go home. We had an office. I got to go and sit at a desk every day with a typewriter on the desk. But I helped guys with their resumes, and I helped guys search for jobs when they're about to go home, and I helped guys enroll in college classes, and I helped guys with their taxes, and I helped guys, you know, write letters to child support, to, you know, whatever issues guys had, I helped them with that, and it was very rewarding to start helping people. And it was as normal as prison could be to go to a job where I got to sit at a desk every day. And in my office, I was the least educated, which is weird. I was just the lowly accountant. So, you know, I only have a BA in accounting, and some of the other guys in my group, the guy who convinced me prison is an opportunity is a double major from Purdue with a Northwestern MBA. And then another guy in my office was a Harvard undergrad with a University of Chicago MBA. So I was kind of like the doofus in the office. But our other big job was teaching classes, all the night classes. So if we couldn't find instructors for the adult continuing education classes, our office had to teach them. And so they basically said, guess who's teaching personal finance now that we don't have an instructor? So for me, I'd always been truly the backroom accountant, that I didn't want to talk to clients, I didn't want to talk to customers, I didn't want to talk to coworkers. If I was in a meeting of more than 2 people, I was not going to say a word. I couldn't speak in front of a group. It petrified me. So when they said, hey, you're going to start teaching all these classes, I was scared to death. But it was a great learning opportunity to stand in front of 40 inmates that didn't want to be there and try and keep their attention. And so it was a new skill for me, and it was very educational to get up there and do that. It was also rewarding. It was fun to try and connect with guys and help guys get ready to go home. Now, I was kind of the perfect person to teach all these financial issue classes to guys because I had every financial issue. I had back taxes, I had credit card debt, I had child support, I had all these financial issues that all these guys had, and I was trying to work through it at the time. So it was a nice gig. It was educational and rewarding. The other thing, more so rewarding, was the prison had what they called a community outreach program, where local college kids would come in and a group of white collar guys would tell their stories, and then we would do a Q&A, and they said, hey, do you want to be a part of this program? And again, I thought, you want me to stand up in front of a group of kids I don't know and be honest, tell my story? Obviously, honesty was something I was never real good at in the past. And just in general, standing in front of a group and talking scared me to death. They convinced me to do it, which I'm very happy that I decided to do it. So the first time I did this, I had to tell my story to 8 students, and I was petrified. To tell my story, literally we would tell our story in 10 minutes and then take questions. And there was no real message. It was almost like a circus show of, hey, look at the inmates kind of thing, you know. They would just sit us up there and stare at us. But the guy that, you know, prison is an opportunity, that guy who's now, you know, my best friend, he wanted to turn that program into something with a true message. And so the program evolved into, it went from just us speaking to college kids to, you know, our goal was to get off the compound and get out into the community, because we, you know, wanted to get off the compound, first of all, but we wanted to really grow this program. And we were lucky enough that the warden was a part of a local group of business leaders, where she had us speak to this group of business leaders, and they said that was an amazing presentation. We'd like you guys to come and speak at the Chamber of Commerce. And they convinced the warden to let us go out into the community. And after that, we started getting requests often to go and do things like that, whether it was local chamber events or Rotary clubs. There were nonprofits, different types of audiences. And then from there, we started getting requests from companies to come in and do like annual compliance training, fraud awareness training. So the first time that happened, they brought us to a local utility company, and the head of compliance at this company brought us into a conference room, and he sat us down and he said, listen, all of our employees are in the cafeteria. Nobody knows you guys are here. I'm going to surprise them, and I want you guys to spice up our compliance training. And he was just giddy. He was so excited. And a really, you know, funny, kind of goofy guy, but he had us all jazzed up to go in there. So we walk in there, and everybody was like, oh, you know, inmates. And so we did like 3 hours, and I think it was a compliance training that company had never had before, and people loved it. And so we started getting requests constantly around the community to keep going into companies and doing this thing, and it was a super rewarding job. And it actually got to the point where companies were calling the prison and saying, hey, we want the accountant to come in and talk to our internal auditors. And the prison was like, listen, we're not taking these guys out every week. Like, they got things to do. So they were turning down opportunities for us. So for me, it turned into something that later on I could continue outside of prison because of the networking and connections I made while I was in prison. And the real life-changing part of what this program did for me was, it was a couple things. Number one, it really built up my confidence. To go out and to have people respond to my story positively showed me that I do have some worth. You know, people can learn from what I did, even though I made a lot of mistakes. I have a lot of knowledge and skill and experience that not everybody has, and people can learn from that. And that was really a big self-esteem and confidence booster for me. And the other thing was, I'd kind of gone through life feeling like a victim, very wrongly thinking that society wants me to fail and that people aren't there for me, you know. And what I learned as we spoke, and again, the feedback we got every time we spoke was so positive, I thought, society is good. People are good, and they're willing to accept you, and they're willing to help and support you. You just have to be honest, and that's something I'd never been. And so it was a very positive slap in the face that, number one, when you get out of prison, society is going to accept you back. You just have to keep doing the right thing, and people are going to be there for you and support you. And that was a great message for me. It really gave me confidence leaving prison that life was going to be okay. And so my current employment situation, I work for a CPA in the Twin Cities. I met him in the visiting room in prison because I was in prison with his son. So that was some job interview. But he was aware I had just been published in the Journal of Accountancy from prison, and he knew that I was speaking and everything. And he basically said to me, you know, when you get out, give me a call. And he said, I would hope that someone would make an effort to help my son when he gets out of prison, so I'm going to help you. And he said for him, first of all, he's like, I'm going to help you. We need to figure out what you can do, because obviously there's certain limitations on what I could do, especially when I was on home confinement. But what happened was, as soon as I got home, I started getting calls from all these companies in Duluth that were trying to bring me in, and they said, listen, we'll pay you to come in and do all these things. And I thought, well, that's an amazing business opportunity, but I can't do it for myself. So I talked to the CPA, and I said, people want to hire me to do this stuff that I've been doing for years. And he said, well, let's turn it into a business. And for us, neither of us approached this as a money-making opportunity. We approached it as a giving back opportunity. For me, I don't think I've ever done anything as therapeutic and rewarding as telling my story over and over and being honest. It helped me become an honest person, and I love it. It's just so rewarding. And for him, he looked at it as a way to help me on a personal level, and he looked at it as a way to give back to his industry. He looked at it as a way to strengthen the integrity of the accounting profession by using my story. And so, for both of us, it's kind of like the right thing. You know, it's not a money thing for us. It's a doing the right thing. And for me, it's a constant reminder of the rewards of doing the right thing. I get positive feedback every time I speak, and it reminds me how good it feels to do the right thing. So it's kind of a win-win for me. So that's kind of my life now. I live in my sister's garage, and I'm completely broke. I did just get off of $4 million this week, but I still owe $7.6 million in restitution, so it's not like I'm home free. But yeah, that's my life now. I'm a parent, and the weird thing for me is I don't think many people look at going to prison as a positive thing, but I'm really grateful for where I'm at now. So even though it took a nasty downfall, and obviously I wish I hadn't hurt that many people and done the bad things I did, but for me, I'm grateful to be where I'm at now. And prison gave me an outlook on life I never would have had, to not take anything for granted, to truly appreciate life and what's really important. I'm happy and grateful to be where I'm at now. So it took me 43 years to figure it out, but I'm finally happy. So.